Well, we can get started, Gary. I think we have already people. They will just keep coming in, and they will be accepted by Molly. Good afternoon, everybody. It is an honor for me to introduce today's speaker for the School of Environmental and Forest Science Seminar, Dr. Gary Morishima, good friend of the University of Washington, and actually alumnus from the University of Washington, good friend of personal friend, and an affiliate faculty also in the school. Dr. Gary Morishima has a bachelor's degree in mathematics and a PhD from the quantitative science and environmental management. Uh, Dr. Morishima has been working in Indian issues and tribal issues since he was a graduate student, doctoral student. He started working with the fishing rights and as an advisor. Even he was in the modeling side. He was a great advisor for the tribes back during the Ball decision, and finished the PhD and started working for the tribes since then. He has more than 40 years of experience in computer simulation, modeling, natural resource management, in forestry, fisheries, economics, policy analysis, mathematical statistics, organizational workshops, conflict resolution, meeting facilitations. In addition to being a technical advisor for the Quinault Nation since 1979, he also owns a natural resource consulting firm called Morishima LLC. One of the things Gary is going to talk today is about Indian forestry, America's first stewards, rooted in the past, acting today to create the future. One of the things that also Gary did was he was one of the founders of the InterTribal Timber Council back in the 70s again also, and has been in several capacities in ITC, still one of the leaders for the ITC and mentor from many of us. Well, without further ado, Gary, please go ahead. Oh, one more thing before you start. Please put your questions in the chat, and at the end of the session, we are going to try to go through most of them. And if there is time, probably we'll open also the raise your hand, and we may open the microphones if we have time. Please go ahead, Gary.
All right. Well, thank you. I'm very pleased to be here with you today to hopefully give you a little smattering of Indian forestry. Indian tribes have been the sort of the forgotten forest managers, forgotten stewards for far too long. A little bit about me. Ernest has given you an introduction. I'm just giving you a little bit of email address and my phone number if anybody wants to get in contact with me. I've got a lot of ground I want to try to cover today, 5 major topics, a little bit of history, some information about the Bureau of Indian Affairs, how the InterTribal Timber Council was formed, independent status, independent assessments of the status of Indian forests and Indian forestry. And lastly, a little bit about an initiative of the InterTribal Timber Council called Anchor Forests. Getting into a little bit of history, this was once Indian country. It had purple mountains, majesty, vast prairies and wildlife, green water and fish, and park-like forests. But despite appearances, the land was not a wilderness that was untouched by man. In fact, there were many settlements and many tribes that occupied North America and all of the Americas virtually. This is just a photo of a city called Cahokia, which was the largest city in North America, just across the river, what's now St. Louis. But early suppositions that there were few Indians, which had little impact on the environment, really set the stage for a series of preconceptions and myths about people, fire, and natural resources on the land. In fact, North America and South America were replete with cultural and ecological diversity, supporting a vast diversity of tribal cultures that were tailored to their environments. There are many different peoples, ways of knowing, and ways of learning. They lived in something that today is called ethnoecology, using materials and resources from the land to sustain their lifeways. But what once was began to change about 500 years ago. And what happened? Well, these two dates or books by Charles Mann can give you an idea. The first book is 1491, which talks about what the Americas were like before Columbus, and 1493, what happened to the land after Columbus. In 1492, of course, was Columbus, where he sailed the ocean blue and claimed to discover the Americas and assert dominance and control on behalf of Spain. But he forgot about the people who lived on the land already, because they weren't Christians. And being Christians, they weren't really believed to have any right to the resources of the land itself. But settlement and development brought many changes to the land, and radically different notions of governance, property, and economics were imposed upon Indian tribes. And in the blink of an eye, tribal management was displaced by Western religions, disease, force, policy, and even science. From religion, the Papal Bull Decree in 1455 set forth a principle called the Doctrine of Discovery, which said that non-Christian peoples could be invaded, captured, vanquished, subdued, or reduced to perpetual slavery, and to have their possessions and property seized by Christian monarchs. The diseases that were brought by the colonists devastated native populations here. On the left, you see a graph showing what happened to the population of Native Americans of central Mexico, from roughly 25 million to less than 1 million within a few years. Brute force was also applied. A series of Indian wars between what became the United States and Indian tribes to force them to move. A formal renewal policy that was enacted by President Andrew Jackson, the 7th president of the United States in 1830, which relocated various tribes from the eastern portion of the United States to the west. Over time, the land that had been occupied and owned by Indian tribes were vastly reduced, and only small islands of Indianness still remain, roughly 55 million acres now. These little dots of land, and these maps just illustrate the succession of land removals or transfers, if you will, from tribal land holdings to the little small reservation dots that you see here in 1990. But from its earliest days, the U.S. policy and U.S. intent was to erase the Indian presence from the land. Tribal science, ways of learning and knowing and teaching were displaced. The academic and science systems were shaped by the Royal Society of England in 1660, and the basis for the standard of scientific peer review and priorities were established as early as 1665. But today our world has become sick and is getting sicker. One example of this is what's happened with the exclusion of tribes and their use of fire. Fire was an integral part of the environment and a tool that was used and applied by various ways within the tribal communities. The principle of application of fire was respect for the land and its relatives by caring for it. And for thousands of years, the Native Americans used fire to transform North American landscapes. But with displacement of tribal management, a culture of fire suppression resulted. And that culture was actually perpetuated by denigrating tribal management and tribal approaches towards the environment. Just called to your attention a couple quotations from that time of the early 1900s, which talked about light burning, which was practiced often by tribes, was viewed as the most undesirable and most mischievous from the standpoint of forestry. And although Leopold said it was absurd to assume that Indians fired the forest with any idea of forest conservation in mind. These perceptions have led to the imposition of fire suppression policies and has had devastating consequences for the forest and the land. Insects, disease, and drought. Roughly 129 million acres of trees have died just in California, national forests, due to conditions caused by climate change since 2010. Our forests have become uncharacteristically dense, lacking diversity, and when they burn uncharacteristically hot. Chief Vicki Christensen of the Forest Service recently testified that about 80 million acres of our national forests are ripe for severe forests, and that the scale of treatment that is needed is just not big enough. We're not reducing the risks, and America's forests are in crisis. The federal influence in Indian forests is marked by the influence of the Bureau of Indian Affairs and vacillating Indian policy. The Bureau of Indian Affairs was created by the Secretary of in the Department of War in 1824. The original Continental Congress had established a Committee on Indian Affairs that was headed by Benjamin Franklin in 1775. But in 1849, the Bureau of Indian Affairs was transferred to the newly formed Department of Interior, and the 19th century marked a time of Indian treaty making and removal. Indian forestry during this time in the 19th century, Indian forests were largely exploited with widespread trespass, a lot of illegal logging. Indian agents were administering timber sales, but there was no planning for sustainable forest. Timber was a nuisance that stood in the way of US assimilation policies, and tribal values were ignored. In 1889, legislation was enacted to authorize the sale and disposal of deadened down timber from Indian lands. And in 1887, a policy called general allotment was enacted, which broke up communally held tribal lands into individually owned allotments. In 1908, a cooperative agreement was established between the Departments of Interior and Department of Agriculture to manage Indian forests. And in 1909, Indian forests received funding to manage Indian timber. And that was primarily administered by Gifford Pinchot. But in 1910, friction arose between the Forest Service and the Department of Interior, which ended that agreement. In 1910, the Indian Forest Service was created within the Department of Interior, and the first Chief Forester, J.P. Kinney, served in that office for over 2 decades. J.P. Kinney was was an adherent of science-based sustained yield forestry. He was adamantly opposed to the policy of allotment, but the policy of tribal management, tribal values were still displaced. World War II prompted the demand for more timber versus sustained yield. And in 1953, a policy called termination was adopted by the United States, where the United States attempted to divest itself of its obligations and responsibilities under treaties with tribes. The predominant federal objective under federal administration was to generate revenue from timber sales. Over time, a bureaucracy of laws and regulations had developed, and something called the Federal Trust Responsibility to Indian tribes, which is similar to a fiduciary relationship. But these bureaucracies, laws, and regulations, and the pervasive presence of the Bureau of Indian Affairs caused many people to think that BIA stood for Boss Indians Around. So Indian law and federal tribal relations are very complex and have a very difficult history to follow and understand in terms of what's happened over vacillations of Indian policy. There were conflicts during this time between the practice of forestry and the policy of assimilating Indians into the mainstream. That had many disastrous consequences for tribal forests. At Quinault, for example, there was a lengthy history, a troubled history of investigation and controversy over forest management. Congressional hearings were held in the mid-1950s, which addressed issues like stumpage rate discrepancies, credit and payment practices, accounting for timber, and ignoring sustained yield requirements. This was a time of controversy and the emergence of a concept called tribal self-determination to replace the paternalistic relationship and administration of Indian affairs by the BIA. It was a time of great tribal activism. This was a photo of the longest march in Washington, D.C. in 1978, which was really symbolized as an era of militancy. At Quinault, tribal leadership also took action by closing their beaches to the public. They closed the reservation to logging, and the Mitchell case was filed in 1971, alleging mismanagement by the Bureau of Indian Affairs and a breach of federal trust responsibilities. This was a symptom of nationwide concerns that were being raised. In 1971, we also saw the occupation of Alcatraz, and in 1972, the occupation of the Bureau of Indian Affairs in Washington, D.C. This was a time when legal rights were being affirmed. The Bolt decision here in the Northwest was decided in 1974 by Judge George Bolt, which affirmed the treaty rights in the case United States versus Washington. During this time, forestry problems on Indian reservations had become very evident. The GAO and the American Indian Policy Review Commission reports identified serious deficiencies. The Bureau of Indian Affairs forestry program was underfunded and understaffed, and management was dominated by a focus on timber sales, and tribal goals and objectives for management were going unheard. Indian forests and tribal communities were paying the price. By the 1970s, the land and resources on the Quinault Reservation had been devastated. This is a photo of 60,000-acre clear cuts that resulted from long-term timber sales that had been put in place in the early 1950s. This is what I saw when I went to the Quinault Reservation in the late 1960s and in the early 1970s. There were formidable rehabilitation problems that were going unaddressed, not only clear cuts, but brush fields that had been in place since the 1920s. This began to change in 1975 with enactment of the Indian Self-Determination and Education Assistance Act, Public Law 93-638, which gave tribes the ability to develop and manage their own programs and a chance to redirect resources to better fit tribal goals and objectives. Timber management by the Bureau of Indian Affairs had wreaked havoc on the land of Quinault and elsewhere, and tribal leadership asked me to come in to help build a forestry program from scratch, and they provided the opportunity and the support to do so. Building a tribal forestry program from scratch was no easy task. myself and Larry Workman, who had just gotten back from assignment in Africa, worked together to try to craft a forestry program. We built a comprehensive program and sought congressional support. We secured congressional support by obtaining dedicated funding for the Quinault Forestry program, but the Bureau of Indian Affairs was loath to abandon its paternalistic ways, and recalcitrance was met at virtually every corner. That essentially was a stage that we were working in when we talked about the need to establish a larger organization that expanded beyond Quinault to encompass all tribes to help create the atmosphere that would be necessary to effect change in the management of Indian forests. This was based upon the recognition that the health of natural resources and tribal communities were intertwined, and that healthy, productive natural resources and the opportunities for income and meaningful employment were important, as well as the foods, medicines, water, and fuel, and places for renewal of spiritual and religious practices. Natural resources were always essential to the cultures, life ways, and identity of tribal communities. They were still abundant in Indian country, but suffered from years of neglect and abuse, insensitive or corrosive development, encroachment, expropriation, and lack of investment. The final straw came when the Bureau of Indian Affairs refused to listen to tribal leadership. When the tribes had fought long and hard to try to convince Congress to fund the forestry development program, but the Bureau of Indian Affairs refused to allow tribes to have a voice as to how that money would be expended. Leadership at that time had enough. The primary leaders came from a few tribes here in the Northwest. Ken Smith, who was the CEO of the Warm Springs tribe, he actually served as the first president of the InterTribal Timber Council. He also became the second Assistant Secretary of Indian Affairs. Joe Dela Cruz, who was the chairman of the Quinault tribe, was also an ITC founder. A number of other tribes, such as the Makah, were also involved. So this leadership decided it was time to try to act, that it was time to take action. The ITC was formed in 1975 at a tribal symposium that was convened in Seattle to allow Indian tribes, people from academia, industry, and agencies to share their views and perspectives of Indian forests. That symposium was called Making Dollars and Cents Out of Indian Forestry. What we heard at the symposium was the great contrast between how Indian forests were being managed and other forests were being managed. The decision was made that we had to do something about this. We had to create an organization or a means to effect change. So we decided to form the InterTribal Timber Council. The name of the InterTribal Timber Council was itself hotly debated. Well, ultimately, we decided that we would make no excuse for the need to harvest to maintain the health and productivity of tribal forests and their environments, to provide employment and income to support communities. Also recognizing that harvest and the management of timber resources and forests were part and parcel of fundamental tenets of tribal stewardship, the principles of reciprocity and respect, to care for the land and your relatives, and the need for active management, that neglect of resources was not the same as respect. The InterTribal Timber Council was formed to pursue a variety of objectives, to promote sound economic management, to provide information, to facilitate communication, to develop partnerships, to support forest-based business enterprises and encourage training and development of Native American professionals. Indian forests, the ITC recognized that our land is what makes us who we are. Indian forests still are present on 334 forested reservations in over 36 states, encompassing roughly 18.6 million acres of land. The InterTribal Timber Council recognized the need for a unifying vision, that if you don't know where you're going, any road will take you there, in the words of Lewis Carroll. ITC's vision was that tribal governments had to come first, that the ITC would serve to provide information and a process to develop common goals and a common agenda to effect change. It would rely on tribal government support rather than building its own bureaucracy. The ITC had a choice to either fight or try to collaborate. It chose to work together with the BIA and others to address challenges and build partnerships and trust. A nationwide consortium of tribal governments has been formed and has been functioning for over 45 years now. The InterTribal Timber Council holds annual National Indian Timber Symposiums that are hosted by tribes in their homelands, where information is shared and different approaches and recommendations for fixing problems are identified. This consortium has worked to establish the National Indian Forest Resources Management Act, which is the primary legislation that serves as the foundation for tribal management. It also worked to develop things like the Secretarial Order 3206 on endangered species, also the Tribal Forest Protection Act and the Farm Act. The ITC has sponsored hundreds of scholarships to increased accessibility to higher education. The ITC is fortunate to have built a solid foundation. It took a lot of hard work and dedication to advocate. And some of that has been recognized. By working together, a great deal has been accomplished. This is a photo of a former ITC president, Fred Matt, received Interior's Conservation Service Award on behalf of the InterTribal Timber Council. But the past is prologue, and the only time you should ever look back is to see how far you've come. The present, trying to figure out, are we out of the woods yet? And that led really to the enactment of the National Indian Forest Resources Management Act and something called the Indian Forest Management Assessment Teams and Indian Independent Assessments of Indian Forestry. The National Indian Forest Resource Management Act requires independent assessments of Indian forests to be completed every 10 years. These reports are provided to Congress and the administration. So far, 3 have been completed in 1993, 2003, and 2013. The 4th assessment is now in process. The idea behind the UFMAT reports, the Indian Forest Management Assessment Teams, which were the independent panels that were compiled to do these assessments, was simply to tell it like it is. What they found was that annual funding per acre is clearly inadequate and declining, that Indian country has suffered dramatic losses due to chronic failure to harvest full annual allowable cuts and the failure to provide investment having disastrous and serious consequences. Indian forestry is at a tipping point. Chronic underfunding and staffing shortfalls have jeopardized the future of Indian forests and their communities. We're seeing increasing threats of catastrophic loss from wildfire, insects, disease, drought, etc. And economic and employment benefits are being lost as opportunities are going unpursued. The Indian trust responsibility that the United States holds for management of Indian forests is set forth in the preamble to the National Indian Forest Resources Management Act, which explicitly recognized that the United States has a trust responsibility for sustained management of Indian forests and had expressed concerns with government's ability to fulfill its obligations. 2 decades later, IFMAT 3 found that the federal government continues to inadequately fulfill its trust obligations to Indian forestry. But the bottom line that the IFMAT studies have found is that Indian forests has been able to do more with less, and that less funding and diversity in Indian country have really led to innovation and creativity, resulting in Indian forests being models for multiple use sustainability. But it seems that trouble is still everywhere. Threats to Indian forests continue from fragmentation, invasive species, climate change, white bark pine, blister rust in this picture on climate change in the lower right. Wildfire are prevalent. 3,800 wildfires burned over 630 acres in 2005 and 2015. And that's expected to worsen under climate change. Climate change, water and forests, we're seeing droughts, flooding, and sea level rise under climate change that has great effects on snowpack, temperature, ecological impairment, habitats, and water supplies. Can tribal forest management really be sustained? That was the question that we're looking at. And that led the ITC to begin to explore a concept called anchor forest, which is a strategy to restore forest health. With all these challenges facing Indian forests and other forests, we had to figure out what could we do to try to change the impossible to the possible. So with nothing but vision and what 40 years ago, a few leaders set out to make a difference and build the ITC, now it was time to begin to have our turn at the plate and to make it so, to make a difference. To recognize that today is different from yesterday and that tomorrow is going to be different forever. It was a time to act, recognizing we can't afford to wait much longer. But what was the problem? We're losing our forests. Forest health is deteriorating. We're unable to sustain ecological functions and economies of rural communities. We're seeing political conflicts, complex administrative processes, and legal challenges impeding the ability to manage the land. Increasing threats and costs of catastrophic wild losses from insects, disease, and wildfire, and growing uncertainty with climate change, invasive species, disappearing management, harvesting, transportation, and processing infrastructure, and increasing reliance on substitutes and imports. So the idea of establishing or promoting anchor forests came about as a pathway to landscape scale conservation. It was a proactive approach with three major goals: to restore the capacity and infrastructure for forest management, to coordinate management across ownerships to address forest health and ecosystem process issues, and to provide economic, social, and cultural benefits to local communities. An acre forest is a relatively large, multiple ownership area that is capable of supporting long-term wood and biomass production levels, backed by local infrastructure and technical expertise, endorsed politically and publicly to achieve desired land management objectives. The components of anchor forests are roughly regional in size, with roughly a 60-mile radius for working lands, multiple ownerships, collaborative processes to address and rectify infrastructure loss in harvesting, transportation, processing, and management. Long-term forest plans and a commitment of supply to support the development and maintenance of viable infrastructure. The ITC undertook a pilot project in Eastern Washington. 3-acre forest areas were examined: the south central, north central, and northeast portions of Eastern Washington, because each of these areas were facing different types of ecological and economic issues, and also had different degrees of tribal involvement and tribal presence. The desired outcomes is to build relationships and common vision, to reduce administrative and legal challenges, to establish collaborative partnerships, to have shovel-ready projects for implementation at scale, and to provide interagency cooperation to work together to develop and improve management, harvesting, transportation, and processing infrastructure. But at its core, recognizing that acre forests are really more than trees. They involve places and communities. And Indian tribes and Indian forests are keys to the development of acre forests, because tribal reservations and Indian tribes have recognized long-term commitments to stewardship and permanent land bases. They understand the need for the triple bottom line for balanced management to achieve economic, environmental, and cultural outcomes. They have management and operational expertise and can bridge gaps in terms of management approaches and management philosophies. They bring to the table traditional ecological knowledges supported by Western science. They bring to the table reserved treaty rights, and they have important political and legal relationships with the United States and government-to-government relationships with other communities as well. Our forests are in trouble, and America's first stewards will be key to caring for our nation's forests and sustaining benefits. They have permanence of place, vision and moral responsibility, experience and adaptability, creativity and innovation, and unique political relationships and legal rights. The tenets of tribal forest management could serve us all well. We care for the land so it can care for you. Respect, reciprocity, and relationships lie at the core. All things are connected. With only small islands left, tribes understand the need for collaborative partnerships to care for the land. The world and all its creatures are alive and interdependent. We have a moral covenant of stewardship. Tribes have recognized this for generations. They know the need to sustain cultures and economies, that all things are connected in space and over time. They look to the past for the roots and foundations and the tenets of management. They understand that the decisions they make today are going to affect future generations to come. There's increasing interest in perspectives of indigenous peoples worldwide, and a growing recognition, both policy and scientific, of the limitations of Western science and the need for long-term place-based information. For historic reference, for adaptation and monitoring change. The importance of First Nations and tribal communities and their traditional knowledge in policy formation and implementation is becoming more and more to the forefront. Whole books are now being written about this. I hope that I've given you just a little bit of food for thought. Thank you for your kind attention.
Well, thank you, Gary, for the great presentation and all the you sharing the experience with us. And if the audience have any questions through chat, I would like to see them. I don't see any questions, and I don't think we can unmute. Any questions for Gary? I have a question. There is a question from Sarah Hogland. What's your idea of the biggest bottleneck for implementing anchor forest?
I'm sorry, Ernesto, could you repeat that?
What is the biggest bottleneck in implementing anchor forest?
Well, a number of them. The pilot project that I mentioned earlier was done in cooperation with the U.S. Forest Service. And one of the things that we recognized in the study areas was the large influence of federal forest lands. But federal forest lands have been really stymied by a very complex administrative process that is fraught with the legal and administrative challenges. So the ability to implement projects at the scale that's really necessary to provide the the supply of wood products and also treat the land and restore the land has become very difficult. So only very small scale projects have actually been possible at this point. So we're unable to really address things. Vicky Christensen had mentioned that millions of acres of Forest Service lands need attention. The condition on those lands also threatens nearby lands that are owned by tribes, private interests, state agencies, and others. So we've got to find the will and the means to actually be able to overcome some of these administrative challenges, to try to form this common vision that is going to enable action to occur, to enable active management of our forest to actually begin to be practiced again. That's been a major hurdle. Without federal lands in the three study areas, we're unable to really secure the adequate supplies that are necessary to fully implement anchor forests. Other parts of the United States are interested in exploring or undertaking anchor forests, but they're also are suffering from a loss of infrastructure. The mills and the transportation, the management ability are being lost rapidly. And that is really posing some really severe problems for our ability to implement the economy, and the loss of infrastructure has also affected tribes. Tribes that used to have vibrant mills, many of those mills are no longer able to function. Only two of them are really currently functional at Yakima and at Menominee. So a lot of the infrastructure in tribes and the tribal communities has also been lost.
Thank you, Gary. There is a question from Dan Brown, our school director. Thanks for the informative presentation. The question is, has the way tribes balance Western and traditional knowledge changed over time?
Well, certainly tribal knowledge and traditional knowledge is not only takes advantage of the lessons and observational knowledge and science that's been gained in the past, but it's constantly evolving. It incorporates traditions and information that's available through modern science and practices that are seen worldwide. At Quinault, for instance, they originally had used dugouts, either canoes, that were paddled by hand to enable them to transport large quantities of materials and also to move from place to place along the rivers and oceans. Over time at Quinault, the canoes were adapted. They were changed to be able to accommodate mercury outboards. And now canoes are being used to as part of their annual holiday celebration in terms of celebrating canoe races up and down the Quinault River. But that's just one example of how traditional knowledge is being changed. And traditional knowledge and tribal knowledge, tribal management, incorporates and adapts to technological changes. It adapts to environmental changes. So it's constantly changing and constantly evolving because circumstances change and the needs and opportunities change as well.
Thank you. Kathleen Wolf, thank you for the presentation. She has two questions. What would be the best way for a young non-Indian person entering a career in forestry to engage with tribes in shared forest management and stewardship?
Well, I think one way is to try to attend the InterTribal Timber Council's annual symposiums. The annual symposiums gather people from all over the country. We were holding these in the homelands of different reservations each year until this last year when COVID struck and we had to cancel the symposium. The ITC symposium will be held remotely this year actually next week. So that's an opportunity to at least get exposed to some of the issues that are out there in Indian country. It's also an opportunity to make connections and connections that will perhaps open some doors and opportunities for people that want to get involved. It's important to recognize that your assistance or involvement is certainly welcome. It is needed, and I think that people are always anxious to get whatever assistance that they can in improving the management of their forests and natural resources.
Thank you. She also has another question. Do you think that Dave Helen, the new Secretary of the Interior, may have an influence on the issues that you describe in your presentation? The new Secretary of the Interior. She's Native American. Do you think she may have an influence on the issues that you have described?
Could you repeat who was that?
The Secretary of the Interior.
Oh, Secretary of Interior, Deb Haaland. Well, certainly she brings to that office a much missing perspective of the impacts of colonization, paternalism, and those sorts of things. She has a great appreciation for the impacts that that's had on tribal communities and tribal resources, and what it means in terms of the ability to help restore the ability of tribes to manage their land and resources and to get a seat at the table for the development and implementation of policies and programs that can benefit not only their lands and resources, but those of their neighbors as well. So I think she's bringing a new perspective and bringing on board some new enthusiasm and values in terms of how we can mount the resources that are going to be necessary to address some of the major challenges that Indian forests and other natural resources that are held by the community at large need to be addressed. To build these partnerships, she is heading up the White House Council on Indian Affairs that recently was reestablished under the new administration as well.
Thank you. And for those of you interested in the ITC Symposium, May 17th to the 20th, next week, Dan Motanic just posted in the chat the link to the registration. And I don't see any other questions here. And any other questions for Dr. Morishima? Going once, twice. Great. Well, I want to thank you to Dr. Gary Morishima for a great presentation today, and all of you for attending the School of Environmental and Forest Science seminar. this a weekly seminar, and you all invited for next week. Well, thank you, Gary, and on behalf of the school, I want to thank you for your presentation.
Okay, thank you. I enjoyed making the presentation, and hopefully, if anybody has any need to contact me, I'm certainly available. So,
And I hope you come back soon. Well, you're coming back on Friday to my class to give
okay,
a seminar.